I've been kicking around this topic for a while, and in light of other things that have come up and continue to be an issue, this is one that really needs to be talked about. On the 6th of January, we came very close to a political coup that could have spun the country into an authoritarian dictatorship. If former President Trump hadn't been so incompetent, those events could have gone a different way, giving him what he wanted potentially: absolute power. And he used a few methods out of the guidebook that has put every dictator into power and made their position almost unassailable. I'm talking about this because if we don't learn from history and more recent events, we are doomed to repeat them. And the next cult of personality that comes along that is more competent than Trump was will put us into a horrifying situation. The first step is getting into power in the first place. It's disturbingly easy to draw people to you if you can unite them against a common enemy, a perceived threat to their livelihood or their safety. Fear is a very powerful motivator, and if the enemy is unseen or far away and unable to defend themselves from what you say about them very easily, either from being a minority or being too far away to correct the lies, you can reinforce that without much issue. That was one tactic that Trump used by blaming Mexico and China in particular any chance he got. He also pushed his image as a businessman, promising to drain the swamp and purge the government of politicians that were corrupt, and promising to make better deals, putting America first, positioning himself as a man of the people. Along with a simple rallying cry of "Make America Great Again," he played to the nationalism and tribalism of the country, and in many cases blatant racism, since his message resonated with white supremacists who already were blaming minorities. People have been getting the shaft by various politicians and leaders in this country for all of my lifetime, and his slogan, while vague, made everyone think about what they thought made America great, and that he was going to fight for them personally. Blaming minority groups for societal problems and to end corruption under his wise rule brings to mind a particular individual from the 1930s and 40s. I don't think I have to drop a name to get the point across, but he has a particular mustache named after him. Whipping his rallies into a frenzy and targeting their anger and perceived slights at one or two groups, playing on the prejudice against both the poor and the rich, was enough to get support from people who didn't know much about him aside from what he presented. An outsider, politically speaking, a businessman who allegedly wanted the best for the common man, and someone who acted like he was incorruptible. With that support and some bad press directed to his political opponent, Hillary Clinton, it was enough to get him into office. And he was more than willing to use the attention of potentially criminal conduct of a rival to further that goal. He had made that first step. He had gotten into power. With the support of the people behind him, misguided as it was, senators and congressmen in the Republican Party now had to start dancing to his tune, or risk being elected out of office by the people they represented, which meant giving the Democratic Party more trouble than usual. He had to crush his rivals. Remember that anyone who contradicted him or was in any way a threat to his power was given a nickname and targeted often by comments that were meant to discredit them in one way or another through Twitter, often through use of ad hominem attacks that tried to discredit the person rather than addressing the argument or position of people who stood in his way. Naturally, people would use these like his MAGA slogan, completely ignoring the criticisms leveled at him. Many people were and still are so fanatically supportive of him that in their minds, he can do no wrong, and using the dominance of the Christian religion encouraged subtly the view of himself as the next best thing as the second coming of Jesus. Many politicians in the Republican Party are still trying to harness that fanatical base today. If you wound up on Trump's shit list, you could expect a surprisingly effective smear campaign, one his followers would eat up, and it extended into the 2020 election season as President Biden's campaign convoy was brought to a halt in Texas by fanatical supporters who could very well have killed him and his escort. He urged his supporters to give them a Texas welcome, vague enough to be seemingly innocent, but driving his supporters to deal with his opponent by proxy. Mostly because at this point, he ruled through terror. The third step. Ruling a population through terror doesn't necessarily mean you hold a gun to someone's head through secret police or whatnot. It's enough, usually, that you simply keep them scared and in fear of something. Fear of the unknown is often all it takes. A vague enough threat reinforced over and over, an enigmatic they lets people put whoever or whatever dangerous person or persons into that slot, much like he did with his 2016 presidential campaign, though there were points he was able to target specific groups with his rhetoric with the, China virus thing. Somehow, he got away with simultaneously downplaying the severity of COVID-19, comparing it to a bad flu, getting people to believe it was a hoax entirely, and that this whole thing was deliberately orchestrated by China to hurt the U.S. financially. Like we already learned, fear is a powerful motivator, and so is anger. He was able to do this because, for the most part, he controlled the narrative. The truth was whatever he said it was, one way or another. Remember back even before the pandemic, he was on Twitter constantly, and even in the press room at the White House, pushing his narrative through conservative right-wing news agencies like Fox as being correct news, while using just 2 words to marginalize and reject anything from more left agencies as fake news. Another little slogan that his followers picked up and ran with. He never actually addressed anything. Calling it fake news was enough for his supporters. The pandemic, as deadly as it was, fortunately highlighted several failings in several areas of local and state government that weren't so easily dismissed by saying it was fake news. It's hard to call hundreds of thousands of deaths fake news when people know the deceased. It's hard to get people to think it was safe to work when people are getting sick. And it's hard to get people to believe that the economy is doing well when people are out of work because of lockdowns. His grasp on power was slipping, and he was running out of time to create a new society from his own vision. So he had to accelerate that, or at least try to. Shaping society to what you want is tricky. You have to keep people focused on what you want them to see and get them to think that you are able to and are fixing it. Not only was there a pandemic, but systemic racism had come to a head all over the country, with the prominent, highly publicized, and senseless deaths of people like George Floyd. I get that there are a lot of people that don't see this mug as being a particularly good face to talk about racism, but male pattern baldness is a bitch, and it's the face I got. I'm fond of what little hair I have left. The country was outraged for different reasons. Sensible people were rightly furious with the brutal and callous nature of police who, having been militarized now, saw the population as a potential threat. And I've talked about this mindset before. These people were calling for police reform, and rightly so. Not every situation calls for an armed response, and more often than not, a measured approach is needed. It is also apparent that police seem to think they are in an active war zone, and pop culture certainly hasn't done much to minimize the idea of a cowboy cop that does what needs to be done without repercussions. On the other side of that, you had people not only supporting the clearly biased nature of police, but actively taking things into their own hands with fatal results. If a couple of good old boys pulls up behind me in a truck while I'm out for a run with firearms in tow and yells at me that they want to talk to me, I'd try to get away too and would be apprehensive even if they were uniformed. I know. I've been there. I got out of my car one day in California to a cop in a plate carrier vest having his weapon drawn and pointed in my general direction. We also saw former President Trump use the police to break up a peaceful protest in D.C. for a photo op in front of a church there. He fueled so much hatred that we haven't been more obviously divided as a nation since before the Civil War. All of this is arguably where he messed up. He let the mask slip too often, and since military leaders were not going to betray the Constitution, he had no way to apply sufficient force to maintain his hold. So he turned to the same tactics that had served him well, but he lost a lot of support by the time the election was coming. He questioned the reliability of mail-in ballots, claiming that it was a system vulnerable to fraud, and began laying the groundwork for claiming a fraudulent and stolen election, planting the idea that the only way the election was going to be valid was if he won, and if he lost, that it was because of fraud. This meant that very few Republicans used mail-in ballots, which the CDC was advising to be used during the pandemic. The system was widely used by Democrats, however, who put their own safety first. Because of that, when votes at the polls were counted, first Trump had a lead. We all figured that would happen, but once the mail ballots were counted, that lead began to disappear quickly, and within a few days it became clear that Trump had lost to Biden. But it was still uncomfortably close, with nearly 50% of the population actively voting for Trump and echoing his unsupported claims of widespread fraud. Legal measures were taken, but unlike Trump's following, the courts require evidence, which is why all of the more than 60 separate filings petitioning the courts in half a dozen states were dismissed. Despite having a majority Republican face on the Supreme Court, they did not overturn the election results because there was no evidence of fraud and it wasn't their place to interfere, not in the way Trump wanted them to. Everything came to a head on the 6th of January, where in a final bid to retain power, Trump had a rally just prior to the certification of the electoral votes and the traditional confirmation of who the next president would be. It had already been determined in today's amazingly fast information age that Biden was the president-elect and that Trump had lost, and as a result, this was just a formality on Capitol Hill. Trump wouldn't let it go, though, and once more whipped his supporters into a frenzy, calling on them to make sure their elected officials did the right thing and that they needed to defend democracy and prevent a theft. He primed them, pointed them at the Capitol, and let them go do his bidding. Some people even taking it as an invitation by the president himself that they were allowed to enter the halls of Congress. People died in the attempted coup, and both the Senate and the House of Representatives had to be evacuated. The Vice President, Mike Pence, and Speaker Pelosi were called for by the rioting mob who wanted to hang them on a gallows that had been built nearby. It took hours to reestablish security and take back the building. All the while, Trump did nothing or very little to contain the situation. If you haven't seen the New York Times report on the event, you need to see it. About 40 minutes of eye-opening horror. I'll link it below. They thought that Trump would help keep them out of trouble, but he never pardoned any of them because they were just pawns. Pieces to be sacrificed for him. Trump tripped at the finish line. The pandemic was timely enough to reveal what he was. Something he had effectively managed to mostly hide from his truly fanatical base. But what if he'd managed to do it? It's hard to know for sure how bad it would have been, but based on history, we can guess. The methods of retaining power and getting it in the first place are and have been used by people Trump tried to emulate in one way or another. Everyone says they'll never follow a dictator, but charismatic people who play on your fears and outrage to their advantage, crush rivals and dissenters, rule through maintaining fear and terror, control the truth, and create a new society, can rule forever. This man came uncomfortably close to securing the U.S. as his country for as long as he wanted. If there hadn't been a pandemic, if he'd been a competent leader, and if he'd had another 4 years, the political structure in the country could have been irreparably damaged and the United States would have become a failed experiment. We hung on. Barely. But the next guy that uses Trump's message and isn't incompetent could likely succeed where he failed. Hopefully we learn from this event and can counter people who misinform the public with their own platforms, like Mark Dice, who recently not only called the Capitol insurrection a peaceful protest, cherry picking one clip out of hours of footage, but criticized the head of the Joint Chiefs for wanting to understand critical race theory and how it impacts society. Mark, having never served a day in his life, apparently doesn't know that knowledge is power, and understanding other ideologies is key to countering threats. Military leaders read everything from the art of war to Mein Kampf to understand and more effectively fight their enemy by knowing what they will do. The point is, if we don't learn from history, we are doomed to repeat it. And we need to learn to see the signs early, because the next time, we might not be so lucky to have a moron threatening our democratic republic with the iron fist of dictatorship.